Listen up, Democrats.
You are fake news.
And lies and facts. Save our democracy from right-wing hypocrisy. We keep our integrity, embrace our diversity. Whenever we are down, we always come back. So listen up, Democrats.
Hello, my name is Larry Taylor. I'm a former delegate to the Democratic National Committee and a professional registered parliamentarian. Today's program addresses how to make the Democratic Party more democratic. The agenda for this session is that we will talk about the options that we are facing now. Since Senator Sanders has suspended his campaign, we'll talk about a problem statement of what we're trying to resolve. Then we're going to go through the rules of the Democratic Party and talk about how the power is allocated, and focus on the anti-democratic sections and how we can remediate them. And then finally, we're going to talk about how you can get involved. So the next slide, we really have three options that we can move forward with. Many people are just walking away from the Democratic Party. They were not pleased with what happened after Super Tuesday, and they are tired of fighting with it, and so they just want to go away and not bother with it anymore. Another group of people want to form a third party. This is a lot of work, and it hasn't been successful in quite a while, but that's what they feel that they need to do. And then the third option is to reform the Democratic Party itself. So the problem statement that we're working with at this point is that the Democratic Party is not structured to operate as a democratic body with excessive power granted to the leadership, power that has been and continues to be subject to abuse. Everyone assumes that the Democratic Party is democratic because it's built into its name, and so there is a disconnect between the way the party operates and the way people expect it to operate. Next slide. So where do we fix the problem? So just as the U.S. Constitution allocates power to the President, Congress, and the judiciary, the bylaws and charter of the Democratic National Committee allocate power from Democrats to its governing body. This is how democratic bodies work. All the power first resides with the people, and then it is allocated out through documents like the bylaws. Next slide, please. So we generally have three ways power is distributed. We have the pure democracy form, which sort of emulates what happened in Athens 2,500 years ago. And you encounter this in garden clubs where the membership is asked to vote on everything that comes across their desk. And so there's a high degree of participation in terms of a democratic process. What we've had in the United States is what we've first borrowed from the United Kingdom. We have basically a representative democracy where we can't all gather together in a field as the Athenians did. So what we do is we elect representatives who then make decisions on our behalf, and then that's a representative democracy. And then we have what I call an autocratic democracy, where not only have we allocated our power to away from the people, but we have pretty much given it all to the leadership. And so next slide, please. These are some graphs that talk about this. So in the pure democratic form, we have people doing a high degree of participation in the decision-making. In a representative democracy, the participation diminishes greatly, and they elect people to make decisions on their behalf. And so you get into our current situation where if you want something done differently, you have to lobby or contribute to their campaigns or whatever it takes to get them to listen to you. And then we have the autocratic democracy where in the laws that we created, we have pretty much handed all decision-making over to someone else. And so we pretty much are stuck with whatever they decide to do. The distribution of power is defined by the rules. Next slide, please. So this is a diagram of how the Democratic Party is structured. The people are down at the bottom, and those are people that are registered Democrats, or in some states vote with the Democratic Party. And their connection with the Democratic Party is directly the precinct committee people which they elect. Unfortunately, the relationship between precinct committee people and the rank and file Democrats is usually not very strong. You get a ballot in the mail every 2 years, and we have one coming up this May here in Oregon, where these positions called precinct committee people are listed on a ballot. No one knows what they really are, but there's some boxes to check, and so people vote. And if you get three votes, then you're elected. It is not common for precinct committee people to have meetings with their constituency and find out what they think the Democratic Party should be doing. And so that's the first breakdown of what goes on. Most people could not tell you what a precinct committee person does or is supposed to do. The precinct committee people then gather in county organizations, and they elect delegates to the state party and to the Democratic National Committee. So first talking about the state party, they elect the state chair, and then the state chair, at least in our state, appoints people to the Rules Committee and to the State Platform Committee. And this is where the work is done. And so you can see that the relationship between the registered Democrats at the bottom and the people who sit in these committees is pretty tenuous. It gets even less direct with the Democratic National Committee, because you elect delegates who then elect a chair of the Democratic National Committee, and then they have full appointment authority to elect to appoint anyone they want to the DNC Rules Committee and to the Platform Committee. And so this is how things like the DNC delegate selection rules get written, and why there is such a vast distance between the people who write that and the people that are elected that elected them initially, the rank and file Democrats. So next slide, please. So if you want to rebalance power, you must change the rules. And of course, this means taking power from one place and moving it to another. And so it probably is going to be more difficult than just transferring power, because no one likes to give it up. Next slide, please. So the power is allocated to the Democratic National Committee and ultimately to the states in a document called the Charter and Bylaws of the Democratic Party of the United States. This is a document, ordinarily when you become a member of an organization, you're given these documents. I was never shared these documents, and back then when I was a DNC member, it didn't occur to me to track them down. I figured that since I was elected and I was going to these meetings at different places around the country every quarter, that I would be embraced by the party and have full participation. Little did I know that all of the power had been transferred to the leadership. And so these quarterly meetings that I attended were basically social gatherings where we would go to caucus meetings and we would go to a regional meeting, but it was really a social gathering where no decisions were ever made. I can remember voting maybe once or twice at the actual session of the DNC, but by and large, it was speeches and thank yous, and President Obama would show up and address the assembly, which was great, but certainly no decision making, because all the power had been transferred from the DNC members to the leadership, and we'll see exactly where that happens in the document. Next slide, please. So the good news is that the goals of the party are golden, and so in the preamble, which is the very first part of the charter, it says, "We acknowledge that a political party which wishes to lead must listen to those it would lead. A party which asks for the people's trust must prove that it trusts the people, and a party which hopes to call forth the best of the nation must embody the best of the nation's heritage and traditions." Oh, this is great. So must listen to those who would lead. So this means that there's a way for the people at the top of that diagram to listen to the people at the bottom, the rank and file Democrats that are registered. And the next statement is very interesting. So must prove that it trusts the people. And so, that trust kind of breaks down when you get to the convention and we have the existence of superdelegates, because the superdelegates are in there to make sure that the people don't get too crazy and, put someone totally inappropriate in the role of nominee for the party and it ends up getting elected president. So what we can do then is tie the rules back to the vision that's laid out in the preamble. Next slide, please. So going on deeper into the charter, we'll start with Article 1, where it says what the Democratic Party does. It nominates and assists in the election of the Democratic candidates for the offices of president and vice president. And number 2, adopts and promotes statements of policy. And so this is where you get the power given to the resolutions committee, and also for the creation of the platform of the party. And then if we go on to the next slide for Article 2, in Section 2, it says that the National Convention shall be the highest authority of the Democratic Party, subject to the provisions of this charter. What that means is that when you convene the convention, they can do any kind of revisions they want to the charter and to the bylaws, as long as they follow the rules. And so the longer process of doing these changes through the Democratic National Committee is circumvented because all the members are there at the convention and they just decide to do what they want to do. Section 3 talks about the National Convention shall nominate a candidate for office of president. And then the last line is what's interesting, is adopt a platform and act upon other such matters as deems appropriate. One of the state chairs recently said that since we have a nominee in Joe Biden for the president, there's really no need to proceed any further with state conventions, because that's really all we do. But if you read the documents, we're actually chartered with developing the platform for the Democratic Party. And of course, everyone says, oh, well, what does the platform mean? No one ever adheres to it. But that's really more of the role of the party holding the leadership of Congress accountable to the platform itself. You know, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi should be checking to make sure that everything they do is consistent with what is in the party platform, if things worked as they were designed. Next slide is about where the democracy starts becoming skewed. And this is where we can propose changes to be made to make the Democratic Party more democratic. So Section 4HI says provide for all of the members of the Democratic National Committee to serve as unpledged delegates to the National Convention. This is where the superdelegates get empowered to go to the convention and vote. And this skews it because we have these delegates who have been elected from the state, but then we have this pile of people who are unpledged, who are basically free agents to cast a vote for whichever candidate they want. And presumably, if there was a close vote between two candidates, the superdelegates could weigh in and make the decision. This can be eliminated because we can adjust the charter. Also, going on to the next slide, it says permit unpledged delegates consisting of, and then there's a laundry list of other people in addition to the Democratic National Committee delegates. So that includes the President and Vice President of the United States, if they're Democrats, the Democratic members of the Senate and the House of Representatives. Next slide, please. The Democratic governors, the former Democratic presidents and vice presidents of the United States. So Jimmy Carter is in there, and Bill Clinton. Former Democratic majority and minority leaders of the U.S. Senate and of the House of Representatives. So all of those people have remain members of the convention. And then former chairs of the Democratic National Committee. So Debbie Wasserman Schultz is still a member based on that. So next slide, a democratic nominating process would be based on the concept of one person is equal to one vote, as well as equal representation at the convention, so that the elected delegates actually represent the will of the people. And you can see from the conversations that's happened over the past couple of months is that everyone assumes that those delegates that we elect from the states have this sort of pure one relationship, and that they actually represent equal numbers of Democrats. But because of the skewing, that's actually not true. So the next slide shows how, in theory, we could correct this. And so what should happen is at a meeting of the Convention Rules Committee or at the Rules Committee of a Democratic National Committee meeting, a member of the committee presents a motion that says, I move to strike from the DNC Charter, Article 2, Section 4H. And all of those extraneous people who are voting delegates of the convention are removed. Now, the path to get to the point where something like this is actually passed and it's struck from the charter is a lot of work. But really, that is the mechanism for making these changes that would make the Democratic Party more democratic. So going on to the next slide, this is more about the National Convention. So this is where it says the delegate vote allocable to each state shall be determined as provided in the bylaws, consistent with a formula giving equal weight to the population, which may be measured by electoral vote and to the Democratic vote in elections for the office of president. This is all good. I mean, this is really how it should be. But then there are things that have been added, which then start skewing the way the vote is allocated. So the next section in Article 2 talks about for the purpose of providing incentives for scheduling the event, constituting the first determining stage of the presidential nominating process in each state, they would alter the number of delegates that each state gets. And so if you've been watching the process, those states that move inappropriately forward in the schedule get penalized, and then states like mine, which is later in the process, get rewarded with extra delegates. So again, that skews the number of voters that each delegate actually represents when they vote in the convention itself. And so in an ideal world, all of the delegates in the convention would represent an equal number of Democrats. And again, just restating that, a democratic process would apportion delegates to states based solely on the number of Democrats within each state, not penalizing early voting states or rewarding late voting states. And again, we can amend the charter, we being the people, if we want to, by just altering the language inside the document, and these sort of violations of democracy would go away. Next slide is Article 4. Talks about the executive committee. So, this is all good. There does need to be a group of people that takes care of the business of the Democratic National Committee in the interim between the meetings of the DNC, because things have come up, bills have to be paid, and so you don't need the DNC members voting on everything that comes across their desk. The next slide is Article 5, and it talks about the national chairperson. And of course, you do need someone at the leadership of the organization to make sure everything is working. And so this is where his power is derived, him being currently Tom Perez. The next, and so we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get into the bylaws. So the second set of the documents are the bylaws themselves. The charter is more of a high-level visionary document, and then the bylaws is a little bit more procedural, although both documents are fairly brief in terms of the amount of power that they allocate. So there's a lot of room for interpretation of what goes on. In the bylaws in Article 2, it talks about the committees. And in any organization, whether you call them work groups or committees or whatever term you use, it's really in the committees where the work is done. So people get together in the committee and they go off and they work through issues and they come up with a solution and they bring it back to the body for acceptance or rejection. And so inside the Democratic National Committee, there are 4 standing committees that do the predominant amount of work in the organization. It's the Credentials Committee, the Resolutions Committee, the Rules and Bylaws Committee, and then the Budget and Finance Committee. The Credentials Committee is chartered with ensuring that the proper people are credentialed, and this is to participate in the actions of the DNC and then by extension to the convention itself. The Resolutions Committee takes in resolutions, which are statements of belief that get passed from time to time by the DNC itself. This is separate from the platform, which is written by platform committee that's associated with the convention. Then we have the Rules and Bylaws Committee, where enormous power is vested. So these are the people that write the things like the convention rules for the delegate selection process that all of the states must adhere to. And then finally, there's the Budget and Finance Committee, which takes care of establishing the budget and how determining how much money we need to raise, and probably has influence on how the money is raised. And so there are things that make Democrats uncomfortable about, some of the ways in which the money is sourced and who the Democratic Party owes favors to based on that. This is the kind of things that could be remedied in the Budget and Finance Committee, in addition to the Rules and Bylaws Committee. The next slide is Article 2, Section 10, which is really where the disconnect between the rank and file Democrats and where the work is being done exists. So in the bylaws, it says that the members of all committees of the National Committee shall be appointed by the chairperson of the DNC in consultation with the Executive Committee, subject to ratification by the Democratic National Committee, and shall be appointed to serve for the tenure of the chairperson. So there's no maximum number of members in the committee specified. So he could appoint 1,000 people if he wanted to, and there is no qualifications over who is appointed. If you look at the membership of the Rules Committee, they seem to be predominantly focused, concentrated in the East Coast. So those of us on the West Coast, and especially California, which has an enormous population, has far less influence than some of the states on the East Coast. But his complete unfettered power to appoint whoever they want, subject to the ratification. And of course, I seriously doubt if anyone has ever been contested as a member of the committee. Again, the slide showing the diagram, if this was a truly democratic organization, then people at the bottom, the registered Democrats, would be voting for the members of these very powerful committees. That's not workable. So what we need to do is find some happy medium between the appointment with no limits by the DNC chair and making this subject to the vote of millions of Democrats. So a better process is that the standing committee members are elected so they're not beholden to the chair, and in a manner that is geographically diverse. And it would be great if they would add qualifications where it would make sense, so that the appointments are not purely political. I know of one person who has a parliamentary background that's a member of the Rules Committee, but he's not a member of the National Association of Parliamentarians, and so I actually don't know what qualifications he has to hold that role. It's probably one of the stronger backgrounds in the committee, because they tend to be political appointments, and so you don't get this understanding of democracy and this filter of, if what we are doing and the rules we are creating are actually democratic, because people don't use that in their decision-making process. They're really basing their decisions and the rules that they write on political considerations. And finally, there's the Executive Committee. It's good that we have it, but again, enormous power has been handed over to the Executive Committee, which is why when I was going to the quarterly meetings, I was never asked to vote on anything for all intents and purposes, because all of the powers and duties had been disseminated to the Executive Committee, and they made all the decisions on my behalf. And so for me, it was a quarterly social gathering that cost a lot of money to attend. It was great seeing everyone and, bonding with everybody, but really as a delegate to the Democratic National Committee, I felt like I had no influence. Now, since then, I have learned much more about, my rights as a member of an organization. And so I can, if I were to assume that role again, I know where the levers of power exist and what I could influence from my role as a member of the organization. Finally, why do we want to reform the Rules Committee? So one of the things that's been happening since the suspension of Sanders' campaign is the continuing election of delegates to the convention. He stated when he suspended his campaign that he wanted to continue accumulating delegates, but that desire of his has run up against the rule that the Rules Committee wrote for the election of delegates to the convention. And so Rule 11C says if a presidential candidate entitled to an allocation under this rule is no longer a candidate at the time of the at-large delegates are selected, his or her allocation shall be proportionally divided amongst the other preferences entitled to an allocation. And you read this and you think, well, that kind of makes sense. But really what that's doing is diminishing the influence by the various candidates. So, the ones that have dropped out no longer have influence. And, Elizabeth Warren had some very particular views that should be represented at the convention, as did Mayor Pete and, even Michael Bloomberg, who got a selection of delegates. But what this is saying is that for all of the states that conduct their statewide delegate selection process after those candidates have suspended their campaigns, they no longer can accumulate delegates. So from my estimation here in Oregon, under the best circumstances, I don't see Bernie Sanders earning more than 13 delegates. And so the 20 delegates that are allocated at the state convention would be given to Joe Biden because he is the final remaining candidate who could accumulate delegates. And so ultimately, the Sanders would get approximately 13, and then Biden will get 58, greatly diminishing the influence of Sanders at the convention because he's not accumulating votes at the rate that he was before he suspended his campaign, and it makes it very difficult for him to attain the goal of 1,200, which is what Larry Cohen wants in order to make some changes structurally at the convention itself, which, as we saw in the definition of the convention, we could possibly do. So in summary, truly changing the Democratic Party means amending the charter and the bylaws. Whatever's going on now and the horse trading between Sanders and Biden and whoever else is involved on who's filling appointments, that's great, but those are just the temporary changes that have no, it's just a gentleman's agreement that they're going to do them anyway. To actually change the Democratic Party to be more democratic, we have to make the kinds of changes to the charter and the bylaws that I've talked about today. And ultimately, reform means transferring power from the leadership back to the people so that the vision that everyone holds and what the Democratic Party is matches the way the Democratic Party behaves. So finally, who should reform the Democratic Party? So in my opinion, it should be a coalition of people, preferably those holding or intending to hold voting power to the various organizations that will be voting on these kinds of issues. And so that's why we have People for a Democratic Party Reform. It's a democratic organization, and it is not political in bias. It's really intending not to reward factions, but to make the Democratic Party a true democratically run institution. And the reason why it needs to be independent is because, as I said earlier, there's horse trading going on between the Sanders campaign and the Biden campaign, and they will be making, these people will be making decisions on our behalf, and they're going to be political in nature. And just as we saw them do some changes with the Unity Commission in 2016, clearly there's a call for a Unity Commission 2.0 so that the changes can continue. But again, we don't need people making compromises before we even had to, we had the opportunity to put a stake in the ground on where we really want the Democratic Party to be. So People for a Democratic Party Reform is seeking candidates that or elect the delegates to the Democratic National Committee. We're looking for candidates or elected delegates to the convention. We're looking for delegates to the state or territory central committees. We're looking for members of the Rules Committee or the Platform Committee of the Democratic National Committee, or to the state party organizations or to the territory committees. And then any registered Democrat interested in reforming the Democratic Party. There's lots of people with enormous amounts of talent who don't hold any of these roles, and we would like to avail ourselves of their contributions. But really, unless we work together and organize with the people who have the ability to vote on this stuff, then it would be very, very difficult to affect change. It's basically resorting us to the lobbying our elected DNC members and hoping that they do the right thing. So when should the Democratic Party be reformed? We should do that now. This is on the next slide. We need to lay out the changes that we would like to see, we the people would like to see to the Democratic Party well in advance of the convention itself, which is now occurring in August. But it's going to take a couple of months to work through the charter and the bylaws to identify the changes that we need, and then start lobbying the people who will have the votes to both bring those changes before the body for consideration and then vote for them and support them to get them passed. It'll take an amount of time to do that. If you would like to participate in this process, and certainly if you fit into any of the categories on the previous slide, the general meetings of PDPO are the third Tuesday of the month, and our next meeting is at 5 p.m. Next Tuesday, April 21st. So I hope you will see us there. I hope you found this enlightening and helpful, and I hope this energizes you and to get involved and not walk away from the Democratic Party. If you would like to join, the website is pdpr.org, and so there's a button that you can click to submit your information, and we can invite you to the meetings and get you involved. If you would like to follow me on Twitter, my identification is ltaylor_PDPR. And then if you have questions that you would like to email to the organization, the email address is info@pdpr.org. Thank you so much for your time today. That concludes the show, Oz, and we will end this.
Okay, we got a couple of comments here. Would you like me to put them up, Larry?
That would be great.
Okay, let's see what we got here. We have from Brahm. Brahm says, I just don't think changing the Dem Party from within is plausible or viable, or a viable solution. If Bernie has taught us anything, he's taught us that we need to get behind or create a third-party options. What's your feeling on that, Larry?
I think the last viable third party to be created was the Republican Party in, what was it, 1854 or something like that. It is really hard to do. It is hard to create a third party, and it is hard to reform the Democratic Party. For all the people that walk away from the Democratic Party, you are just leaving this in the hands of the establishment that is absolutely going to continue doing what they have always done. And so there are those of us who believe that it is a democratic process, even though, as you can see from the diagram, there's a long distance between the rank and file Democrats and the leadership. There is still a democratic process that can be worked, and by using the tools of democracy, we should be able to make those changes. You are absolutely right. It will not be easy, and as I said, people do not want to give up power. But if they do see an exodus of their base to a third party because the third party looks like they're starting to eat their lunch, I think the Democratic Party would come around.
Selena Vickers, I think if we had midterm national conventions, we could get some of these things done. Charter, Article 6 allows for this. Larry?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, William Tell, this two-party system has not served us well. Money in politics rules everything. I don't think we could disagree with that. But again, back to your point, if we sit out and just scream sour grapes, nothing's going to happen. How's your feeling on that, Larry?
Yeah, the three options remain what I articulated at the beginning. You can either walk away because you're so disgusted with the way things have happened. You can pursue a third party trying to create something that's more democratic, or you can involve an existing organization that really needs just a few tweaks to become more democratic. And so, my belief is that my time would be better spent doing the last option.
Okay, Larry. We've got quite a few comments here. I can't see them all. Let me see. Betsy hasn't weighed in. Good morning, Betsy. Betsy, conundrum for decades. I was not interested in reforming the Dem Party because never believed it was possible. However, maybe it is. There is at least a means to make it happen.
Thank you, Betsy.
And I think that's about it. I'll end with this one. Maybe clean the house of the corrupt like Hillary. Well, I can tell you, as far as Washington State goes, William, we've got a bunch of neoliberal establishment Democrats who are going to vote in the best interests of their corporations, and we can get inside the party and try and make change, which I personally recommend, as well as work outside the party. The Pdpr is one of the aspects that I think is going. So thank you very much, Larry. It's been a great show. Any closing comments?
No, I hope everyone goes to pdpr.org and signs up and helps us identify the reforms that we need to make, and then help us form the plans to get them implemented. Thank you.
Listen up, Democrats.
You are baked